Good evening, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted. Oh, I'm losing my voice already. That is a bad sign. I'm really delighted that you've decided to come out on this quite windy, wild Melbourne evening to join us as part of the 2025 Now or Never Festival. And this is a festival of art and technology presented by the City of Melbourne. And the theme of the festival this year is I Have Seen the Future. And our event tonight is aptly named How to Live Forever, which I think goes very nicely together. And tonight's event is presented by the Wheeler Centre in partnership with Now or Never. So good evening, I'm Jen Martin, and I lead the Science Communication Program at the University of Melbourne. I'm also Dr. Jen on 3RRR and on 774 ABC, and I'm really thrilled to be your host tonight. So together we are going to explore this book, which if you haven't yet read, I do highly recommend. And it asks a pretty complicated question, I think, which is, if death wasn't certain, and in fact the very essence of you could be preserved into the future, would you and should you say yes to living forever, or at least a hell of a lot longer than you're currently expecting to live? So a heads up that we are going to be talking about death and end-of-life choices this evening. But before I go any further, I would like to begin by acknowledging that today we are coming together on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And Indigenous Australians, of course, have been custodians of the lands and waterways of this continent for many, many thousands of years. So I acknowledge and pay my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as this country's first people, our first scientists, our first philosophers, our first storytellers, and I repay my respects to elders past and present and welcome any First Nations people joining us this evening. So this book that we're going to be talking about tonight really is one of the most fascinating books I've read in a while. So The Future Loves You, How and Why We Should Abolish Death by Dr. Ariel Zeleznikow-Johnston. Welcome.
Thank
Very
you.
pleased that you're here. So Ariel is a neuroscientist whose research is looking into consciousness and cognitive preservation at Melbourne University. And from everything I've read...
Monash these days.
Sorry, Monash University.
That's right.
Don't mind me. I hang out at Melbourne. Ariel used to hang out at Melbourne. And so everything that I've read about you suggests that you're really driven by wanting to understand how our brains make us us, which feels quite meta and explains why this book is a really damn good read. So thank you for being here tonight. There are so many questions that I want to ask you, but I promise I'm not going to hog him for the whole time. I really promise I will make time for your questions. So there will be a QR code later, a link for Slido. I have my trusty iPad here so that I'll get to see your questions. I also want to say a huge thank you to the Chestnut Tree Bookshop, who do have copies up the back there of Ariel's book for sale, and Ariel is happy to be signing books after this conversation, so stay tuned for that. So if you haven't read the book, just to really briefly set the scene, the core argument of this book is that death isn't inevitable. So Ariel argues that your identity, the essence of who you are, is encoded in your connectome. Your connectome being essentially a high-resolution map of all of your brain connections. And he argues that new preservation techniques could soon allow you to store your mind, offering future generations the possibility of reviving you, which is pretty out there, I reckon. And so he explores in a lot of depth not only whether such preservation and revival is feasible and possible, but also whether it's morally right. So I have to say, first of all, congratulations on the book. It is definitely thought-provoking. I feel like we say everything today is thought-provoking. This one really is. I can't wait to hear more about the ideas that you explore. I have to say I don't agree with it all. That would be where I start from. But I did really find myself being called to reflect and interrogate and question a whole lot of my assumptions and beliefs, which I feel like that's a good place to find yourself in middle age, having to question all these things that you think you know. So before we get stuck into the kind of serious parts of the book, and it is pretty serious. I actually just want to ask, was it fun to write? Because no doubt, well, we were talking before, this is a product of COVID. It took a lot of hours, huge amounts of research. It's not easy to write a book like this, but there's some really fun thought experiments in there. So what might we find if we take advantage of time machines and suddenly transport ourselves into the far future? In this book, there are nanobots that replace our biological brains with cyborg brains to avoid Alzheimer's disease. Teleportation features leading to a fabulous scenario for you to think about. If there's a technical hitch with my teleportation machine on Earth and I end up with one of me here on Earth and another one of me on Mars, which one is actually the real me? So, was it fun to kind of play with these scenarios?
Yeah, I think it was fun in two different ways. One is like, I had this argument that I thought I wanted people to understand and to be able to work through for themselves. So I thought this preservation idea is something we as a society should do, but it's a crazy idea. How would you actually make the argument to someone, break down all the steps so that you walk slowly through it, and at the end you're like, wow, that was crazy, but at each individual step it kind of made at least sense there. So that the structuring, I think, was particularly fun. But the other part that was fun is just like, you end up coming up with some or investigating some weird and sort of just strange questions when you start to reflect on these ideas. Like, for example, one that I opened the book with, which is, why is it that humans live for 80 years instead of 10 to 20 years like our pets, or 200 years like some whales and some turtles? And then you go down these scientific rabbit holes of like trying to work out, how do they even age? Like, how old do you know a whale is? Basically, that there's always these recursively fun little journeys you can go on when trying to investigate these topics. And the best part of doing writing instead of research, which is my normal day job, is you just get to read what other people have done and then tell other people about all these cool fun facts. So yeah, it was fun to write.
Yeah, and I think you've done an extraordinary job of taking some really technical, dense information and turning it into something that's actually really fun and enjoyable and pleasurable to read, which may not have been the case, I think, with this topic. But let's get then into some of the guts of it. Tell us a bit more what you're actually proposing, and I'm interested in. So you're arguing that death is not inevitable, which, isn't that one of the most famous sayings at all, that death and taxes are the only, things that we can be certain of. So what was it in your research background or your own experiences in life that convinced you that maybe death, it's not a necessity, but actually it's a challenge that we could tackle and do something about?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in both the past and future of scientific and medical developments. And it's fascinating to sit here and think about how much better our medicine is than it was 100 years, 200 years ago. And then in turn, how much better it might be in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years from now. And that applies both to medicine, but all sorts of technology. 200 years ago, we didn't have cars, and now we have rockets. So I was interested in that pretty much my entire life from a scientific perspective, but also from a science fiction perspective, thinking about speculative far futures as well. And one idea that comes up a lot in science fiction is this idea of something like cryosleep or cryopreservation, or some means by which maybe you could take a person and render them unconscious, inert, sort of unaging, unchanging for an indefinite period of time, and then pull them out at some point and restore them to consciousness, restore them to health. And I'd come across this idea, but I always was kind of curious about, is this just a plot device that's used in movies and books for changing settings, or could something like that ever actually be made to work? That was always a question I had in the back of my mind. But as I went through my PhD and started my postdoc work, I started to think about it a little bit more seriously as I saw what I thought was more and more neuroscientific evidence that maybe something like that could actually be made to work under the right conditions if done in the right way. And for me, if we could get something like that to work, I think it would be just a logical extension of what we're doing in medical research generally, where we try and buy people a few more years for treating their cancer, we try and buy them a few more years for treating their heart disease. maybe if you had something like this, you could buy people an indefinite number of more years. And that was the motivation for me in working through it.
And are you a sci-fi nerd? Did you spend your childhood reading cool sci-fi books?
Yeah, I'm definitely a sci-fi nerd, as I think almost all STEMmy sort of people are, or at least a lot of them are.
That interests me then that this is the book that you wrote rather than a kind of speculative, science fiction book, because a lot of these ideas you could have explored in that way, right?
It's true. I mean, they have different places insofar as the good thing about being a fiction writer is you just get to explore ideas, run with them, see where it can go, but you're not proposing like this is how it actually works or something we necessarily should do. The other part is I'm much better at writing nonfiction than I am at writing fiction. I really had to work at all those little fictional snippets in it, so I stuck to my strengths.
Yeah. Oh, well, you did them really well. I really very much enjoyed them. So I'm interested then, something that's a core of this book is you explore different ways of defining death. And I'd love you to tell us how you've ended up defining death and really putting that in the context of historically how our understanding of death, because it's changed drastically over the last, 100, 200 years. How are you defining death?
Yeah, I'd say it's mostly changed from the early 20th century onwards. So before then, people were defined as dead pretty much if they stopped breathing or their heart stopped, because at that point, there generally wasn't anything you could do for people from that point onwards. But with the invention of things like mechanical ventilators to help people breathe even when their lungs had failed, or cardiopulmonary bypass machines to help circulate their blood even if their heart had stopped for a while, doctors, ethicists, policymakers started to understand that a more sophisticated definition of death was needed. So particularly in the US in the 1970s, they came up with something called the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which proposed two definitions of death. One based on the old, cessation of heart and lung functions, and one based on irreversible cessation of brain activity, or brain death is how it's referred to today. And that acknowledged that, the technology had evolved, and there were times now where someone's heart might be kept going, or their lungs kept going, or at least their circulation kept going, but it seemed like what was important about the person had been lost, in that all their brain activity was gone and they wouldn't be conscious again. So
that's when people are referred to as brain dead, yeah?
Correct. But specifically, when we talk about brain death, that means the loss of all functions of the brain. That's typically how it's legally written down. And even at the time when this new definition was being come up with, people realized there were a few issues with that definition, specifically irreversible loss of all functions of the brain. So one issue with it is that when we look at people who are declared brain dead but are kept on life support, there often are still little bits of their brain that are functioning to some degree. So for example, the hypothalamus, a brain area that helps control body temperature, some hormonal regulation, it's sometimes still functioning in people declared brain dead. And what happens is doctors say, that doesn't really count. Like, it's not important for what it is to be a person. When we say all brain functions, we don't mean that brain function, which I think is reasonable, but it puts pressure on that part of the definition. The other issue is the irreversible side of irreversible loss of all brain functions, because irreversibility is a function both of the organism, but also of the technology that exists. So nowadays, for example, you never really have irreversible loss of all heart and lung functions if you're allowed to use external technology. Like we have things called ECMO, or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, where you can take someone's blood out of their body, remove the carbon dioxide, introduce oxygen, and return it into a person. And that way you can keep someone alive for weeks without their own heart or lungs functioning. And we don't have anything for the brain that's anywhere near as impressive as that, but we are slowly developing implants that can restore some function to people who've had strokes or spinal cord injuries, give them control of limbs or blood pressure. And so bit by bit, it looks like we're going to be able to reverse more and more and more of damaged brain tissue. So then if we get to a point where we can replace anything, the question is well, then when does a person die? And a different sort of philosophical school argues for the idea that instead of defining someone as dead based on their heart stopped or they can't control their body posture, what we really should be focusing on is when their memories are gone, when their personality is gone, basically when what they consider to be them, their personal identity, is forever lost. So that's a personal identity view of death, and that's what I argue for in the book.
And which is fascinating and very different to, I think, what most of us perceive of as the point at which a person is no longer living. But so what then, as a neuroscientist, what then are the scientific advancements that you've seen during your career that lead you to argue that securing and preserving brain function sufficiently in order to revive it, or another thing we haven't touched on in the book yet is this idea of digital reconstruction. What are the advancements that make you argue that this might one day be possible?
Yeah, I just push back slightly. I think when people have done surveys, there are a lot of people who are sympathetic to a personal identity view of death. That there is quite a range in the community. So some groups, particularly religious groups, often focus on heart or lung functions, but also a very large number of people focus on personal identity stuff. And it's interesting to see which groups think which things. But that's an aside. The question is around what do I think... sorry, I lost myself in the...
What are the advancements that you've seen that lead you to argue that, in fact, we may be able to preserve the essence of who somebody is and either retrieve it later or revive it later, or the other thing which you talk about is digital reconstruction. So, what's going on in the world of neuroscience that's leading to these amazing arguments?
Yeah, so the question for me, it's a similar question to... what is it that enables someone to go to sleep at night, be unconscious for a while, and then wake up in the morning and still be there? Or undergo anesthesia and then still be there at the end? Or even more dramatically, undergo something called induced hypothermia or deep hypothermic circulatory arrest, which is these sort of procedures that are already used in hospitals, where what we can do is cool a person down to about 20 degrees, their heart activity stops, their brain activity becomes silent, it's electrically silent, and then after a period of time, bring them back up again. So even in these circumstances where brain activity stopped, heart activity stopped, it seems like they can come back at the end of this. So the question is, how would we push that from 45 minutes to days, weeks, years, an indefinite period of time? And I think it's the same things that let us naturally survive over time or in these anesthesia circumstances that could possibly enable us to survive indefinite periods of unconsciousness, which would be some way of stabilizing the connections between neurons that encode our memories, our personalities, our personality, these things that give us long-term memory in a very broad sense. So even in natural life, we are constantly changing the material that we're made of as we eat and we breathe and we drink. Every 2 weeks or so, you change out the materials that your synaptic connections are made of. But the actual connections themselves, like the information and the patterns, are maintained over time. Mm-hmm. And what I think has changed in recent scientific history, to finally get to your question properly, is that we've developed much better tools for preserving those in very high precision without having decay processes. Mm-hmm. So what we can do nowadays, particularly we can demonstrate this in animal models, is you can take let's say a laboratory mouse, you can introduce preservative chemicals into its body, and you can do so in a way that ensures that basically everything in its brain gets locked in place at the particular time when that procedure was done. And then if you take very powerful microscopes and you analyze the structures in the brain, you can see they look exactly like how you would expect them to look prior to the animal being preserved, in a way that would make you think that the things that are encoding their memory, their behaviors, basically all the information about their long-term memory is still in there. So it's seeing the improvements in those preservation techniques over time and the evidence for understanding how memories are encoded and that we are capturing those mechanisms that's made me more optimistic about this.
Which is completely wild, really, and presumably kind of untestable, because once you've done the preservation, you can't then go and work out, does the mouse remember the maze, or I mean, how do you test that?
Yeah, so there are ways of being able to test at least elements of this. So we know in part in living mice we're understanding memory better because nowadays we have tools called optogenetics by which we can record specific memories and even force a mouse to recall a specific memory. Mm-hmm. So like you've had it in some scary environment, you put it in a new environment, but you reactivate those neurons and suddenly it freezes like it's scared again. Or you can selectively erase memories in some circumstances. Like there are cool experiments where you teach them how to run along a high wire or how to hold on to a rotating rod, and you can erase one memory but not the other.
Wow.
So that's in the living animals as examples of how we understand brain structure and memory. What people are working on at the moment is looking at preserved brains and being able to show that you can decode memories out of there in a way that proves that the memories are still in there. Mm-hmm. One example of that, which was done late last year, is there was the first publication of the complete map of a fruit fly brain. Mm-hmm. With this map, they even made a bad but a complete digital model of the fruit fly brain and showed that if you did things like you stimulated the neurons that were responsible for tasting sugar, that this digital model would try and stick out its proboscis or stick out its tongue. So it's demonstrating that from this static preserved brain, you can still get function. And ideally what we'll see in the years to come is more and more examples of extracting memories from preserved brains in a way that demonstrates that what we care about is in fact still in there.
Still there. Which leads me then to want to talk more about identity, because I think that's just so fundamental to these arguments. So, what makes you you and what makes me me, and what exactly do you think has to be preserved in order to say that you are living into the future? And I guess where my mind immediately goes is if this future revival kind of works pretty well, but not quite as well as we might think. So, some memories are missing or your personality shifted a little bit. Do you have kind of a line in the sand that you draw where you would say, yes, well, that still counts as me, but actually, no, I don't really think that would be me anymore? Like, how do we make these judgments? These are questions we've never really tried to answer before.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets philosophically difficult and tricky, particularly because, I mean, in normal life, we don't tend to ask this question too much. We don't tend to wonder, are we the same person today that we were a year ago, or will be in a year, or 5 years ago, or 5 years from now? And that's despite the fact that, as I mentioned, we are constantly replacing what it is that we're made of over time. And I think the reason why that's the case is mostly we're like, well, we still have the same goals, we can remember our previous experiences, we feel like the same person, at least to the best of our memory, and our friends and our family all identify us as the same person. But even in normal, natural life, that does come under pressure in circumstances where people might have large changes in their social role, or even more dramatically, things like brain injuries or psychiatric illnesses, those sorts of things. And so the question is, like, how do you draw the line at whether this is or is not the same person? It's hard, and I think it's something that I alone should not be saying, like, this is the line where everyone should draw, and this much change or this much damage would be too much. What I try and do is say, well, where can we give any bounds at all? Where, on the one hand, we know that if someone suffered a concussion and they've lost some memory or they've gotten blackout drunk, then there's been some damage and some loss of their experiences, but they're still the same person. And on the other hand, if somebody suffered so much brain damage that they either won't be conscious at all, or when they do come back to consciousness, it's very different, they don't remember who they were, they and their friends and family think their personalities changed completely, maybe that is a circumstance where there's still a conscious being there that we should care about, but it's not the same person who was there before. But yeah, it's hard to draw an exact line somewhere. And so what I want is some way of being able to preserve enough that, you're like, well, I don't know exactly where the line is, but I'm well clear of the line. But that's a slightly unsatisfying answer, sorry.
Yeah, it is, but by the same token, you do share some really interesting examples of people who have suffered particular, traumatic brain injuries or other situations in which people have drastically changed. For any Oliver Sacks fans in the room, you'll really enjoy some of the stories that Ariel shares about how people's lives can be profoundly changed by brain injuries. And so you do make the point that we are actually already dealing with this. We are already having to make decisions, and prior to and post injury, a person is the same person, but they've changed somewhat. Well, so it's a lot of grey, right?
Yeah, it comes up. I mean, it depends exactly on the injury. Like, one of the fun things I found while doing research for the book, if you ask the families of people who've suffered injuries to their mobility, maybe profound ones, like they've become quadriplegic, and you ask them, is this person still the same person as before the injury? They basically all say, yeah, like, why are you asking?
Of course.
If you ask the same questions to people who've had very profound brain injuries, you get a very different pattern of responses. Where maybe if it's something like some degree of Parkinson's disease, where there's a little bit of motor issues, people will be like, no, that's pretty much still my husband, my father, my grandfather. But when it becomes more severe, you do get people saying, I'm not sure that is the same person anymore. And that's really tricky to deal with.
Yeah, one of the many exciting aspects of what you're proposing. What I'd like to ask you about now is your thoughts on, essentially, if we could abolish death, how would that change how we feel about life? So I want to quote you to yourself. Don't mind me, I'm just going to read a little bit from the book. So you wrote, "Death provides a deadline without which our pursuits would feel senseless and boring. If not for the tick of a countdown clock, we would forever procrastinate. If everyone had endless time to learn how to draw lifelike portraits, solve Rubik's Cubes, or climb Mount Everest, the achievements become meaningless. Eventually, after years and years of this low-pressure lifestyle, we would run out of things to do. In the end, we would feel as though we were stuck watching the same dull television series over and over, trudging around in purgatory, long past the point when our lives had meaning or purpose." Those are your words. I have to be fair, though, and say you then go on to argue very hard that is completely wrong. And that our acceptance of death is basically an example of learned helplessness, and that we don't need life to be finite in order to feel like it has meaning and purpose. So putting you on the spot, convince me that my life would have as much meaning if I didn't have this sense of it being precious and finite and every day needs to count.
I guess I would ask, when you do something that's fun, when you come to an event like this, or when you go to a family gathering, or when you go on a hike, or any of these things, how much of our joy comes from knowing this is only one of a few opportunities I will have across my lifespan, versus how much of it comes from this is intrinsically fun. This is fun because I'm achieving some project that I've been working towards. This is an intrinsically valuable thing to be doing, to be helping people, to be teaching people, to be improving the world in some way. At least for myself, when I consider what I'm motivated to do or what it is that I enjoy doing, almost everything is because I think that thing is important, or it's intrinsically a valuable or enjoyable thing to be doing. Not because I only have a limited set or one day I'll run out of time, but just for the thing in and of itself. Ironically, except for writing a book about life extension, which is motivated by, like, I need to get this done by the deadline. And my guess is that is the case for most people a lot of the time, that it is just that they enjoy going to the football this year, even though it was on last year and the year before, and they'll enjoy going to it again next year, because it's just a fun thing to do with friends and family, rather than because they need to do it before their time runs out. And I think that applies across all sorts of domains. I guess that's essentially my point that I argue for in a variety of different ways, that it seems more likely to me that the reasoning is backwards, where because we know that we have a deadline, that we try and come up with ways to justify why that deadline is useful, rather than because a priori it makes sense. And It does remind me of another example from medical history of when similar sorts of what I see as reasoning was used, where, for example, prior to the advent of anesthesia, you had surgeons telling patients who were about to undergo surgery, look, this is going to be very painful. But they didn't say, and I'm so sorry this is going to be so painful. They would say things like, but the pain is part of the healing process. The pain is good for you. It's necessary in some way. And if there's no anesthesia available, maybe that is a good thing to tell patients because it'll help them and it'll help you as a surgeon not feel so terrible about what you're about to do. But nowadays, that would be an insane thing to say to a patient, to be like, there's no need for this. It's actually an important part. And I am suspicious that the same thing applies when we talk about our limited lifespans.
And so tell me where this idea then of learned helplessness fits in, that we just accept it as inevitable because it currently is inevitable and we haven't felt like we've had the ability or the opportunity to question it?
Yeah, so my question is, like, why do we spend so much money and time on treating things like heart disease or cancer or dementia or all of these individual diseases, which we look at and we recognize are problems and we recognize as things we want to treat. But when considered collectively, it's a project of trying to treat all of the diseases in a way that seems to be we're trying to extend the quantity and quality of people's lives. On the one hand, we seem to be wanting to avoid individual instances of disease. But when you come to talking about, hey, the overall project is treating aging or abolishing death, to be most arrogant about it, in that circumstance, we're like, this isn't something we should consider or that we want to do or we're not sure we should do. And my suspicion is it is this hangover of, well, historically, there wasn't anything we could do about death as an entire project. And so we've come up with all of these ways of normalizing it, of making it easier to deal with, and that's what we're still stuck with culturally.
Like the pain of being operated on
Exactly.
with no anesthesia. Yeah, when I read that, I thought, gee, I'm really glad I'm alive now and not then.
Yeah.
Does not sound very pleasant. Just to let you know, I'm going to switch to your questions in about 10 minutes. So if you're thinking of questions that you would like me to ask on your behalf, please put them. I'm thinking that, yes, there is a code up there. Please add them. And just letting you know, you can upvote each other's questions so that if someone has asked a question that you think is fabulous, if you upvote it, then it'll go to the top of my list and I'll know to go to those ones first. So please let me know what you would like to ask. I feel like the next thing it's really important for us to talk about, Ariel, is equity. So let's imagine that everything, or at least a lot of what you said, has come true at some point, and I'm not going to make you put a year on that because I think that would be very difficult. But if this does happen, who should get the opportunity to do it? Who should decide who gets the opportunity to do it? How do we avoid a future where only the wealthy get to have this opportunity? Because as we all know, new technologies seem to have a bit of a habit of benefiting the privileged first. Like, how could you envisage this working?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thus one I spend an entire chapter on at the end of the book focusing on. The short answer is I think it should be available to everyone. And the lucky thing is, I think it actually, at least for people in wealthy developed countries, could be made achievably available to everyone. But I should justify that. So at the moment, this question already applies with all medical treatments, where, it's like it costs money to provide medicine. And in principle, we want to be providing everyone with as much medicine, as much health as we possibly can. But we have limited budgets. We don't want to spend all of our money on healthcare and medical research. And even if we did, that's still a finite, a limited amount of money. So what we're interested in doing is asking, if we were to pursue something like this, how much would it cost? How likely do we think it is to work? How much bang for our buck would we get in this particular circumstance? And it turns out sometimes that we're willing to justify spending money on very expensive procedures based on them having a good chance of working. So something like a heart transplant surgery costs probably these days around $300,000 in Australia. And it has, I think, if I remember correctly, something like a 30% 5-year mortality rate. So there's a good chance it'll work, but there's also a good chance the patient will die in the not too distant future afterwards. but we say that is worthwhile doing because we want to spend the money as a society to provide people with that increased chance of extra years. So then the question is, how much does preserving someone cost? How much does reviving someone cost? How much would this cost? And the great part here is that the two parts, preserving someone with the idea of reviving them in the future, have different costs. Mm-hmm. And the preservation side, I think, could actually be done fairly affordably. Mm-hmm. For something like, if it was provided at scale, maybe 15,000 Australian dollars or so, and maybe $1,000 in storage costs, or lower, depending on how it was done. And the reason why is because it's actually technically not a very complicated procedure. What you would do is you would take someone who was imminently dying or who'd just been declared legally dead. You would introduce these preservative chemicals into their heart, their blood supply, which you would then circulate around inside their body, locking everything in place, their brain structure in place, the rest of their body in place. And then you would introduce some essentially antifreeze chemicals that would mean that you could store their body at colder temperatures without ice damage occurring. Mm-hmm. And those chemicals aren't particularly expensive. The surgery, as far as surgeries go, would not be particularly expensive or complicated. So it is something that one could imagine rolling out to an entire healthcare system. The flip side is, okay, you've got the body stored. How much would it cost to revive someone to be able to either biologically reverse the damage that's been done to them and restore them to health and cure whatever else it was that was causing them to be dying in the first place, or to do something like uploading them, to scan their brain at very high resolution, to create a new digital model of that brain that perfectly recreates the previous functions, and then give that some, let's say, robotic body or something. And we have no idea how much that would cost at the moment.
Can you put a figure on that?
But presumably it would start off incredibly expensive. And that's where I do think issues of equity would come into clear play. Because it wouldn't be that we could provide that necessarily to everyone all straight away, unless we're living in some very optimistic AI future. But again, the great thing here at least is that, people who are under preservation, they can wait. And most medical technologies have these rapid learning curves where they start off extremely expensive and come down quickly in cost. Think of something like mapping someone's genome, which cost, I think, billions of dollars for the initial mapping in around 2000 or so, and nowadays you can do it for about $1,000.
Yeah. And we see that everywhere, right? Everything starts prohibitively expensive, and with time and effort and experience, it all gets a lot cheaper.
Yeah. So I think it's a really important question and always something we should have in mind. But I think thankfully it's not prohibitive in this circumstance. It's more a question of, do we want to do this rather than could we afford to do it if it was something either as individuals or as a society we decided to do.
Interesting. I'm going to squeeze in one more question before we hand to the audience. And you spoke a moment ago about an optimistic future, and I feel like your title is a very optimistic, hopeful one. Your title that you've chosen is The Future Loves You. So kind of a double-barrel question. Firstly is tell me about choosing that title. But secondly, I don't know, is it just pure arrogance to imagine that our descendants might love us enough that they actually want to revive us? I kind of feel like, what gives you the confidence that our descendants actually might want to have us around, particularly given we're doing a pretty damn good job of destroying the planet at the moment? Maybe they would really prefer to leave us in storage.
Yeah, it's sort of both hopeful and an imperative towards people today, insofar as I really hope that we have stewardship enough to ensure that the future loves us, and I think that people should try and act to ensure that the future will love us. And I guess one aspect as well is it's looking towards the past and thinking about how it is that I feel about our ancestors. So when I sit here comfortably in a warm, air-conditioned environment, vaccinated, knowing that there's hospitals around if I have health issues, I am extremely privileged compared to almost everyone who's lived throughout history before this moment. where only a couple of hundred years ago, 1 in 2 children died before they reached the age of 15. Almost everyone lived in extreme poverty, and even the wealthiest people lived worse conditions than most of us do today. And the reason why we don't all still live in those conditions is because people from previous times work to improve things for themselves, their children, their grandchildren, and to provide the sorts of technologies and social structures and governance structures that we have today to mean we live much more comfortable lives. My strong hope is that we will continue to do the same thing going forwards, and we will solve the challenges of our time at the moment, which admittedly are considerable, whether it's climate change, whether it's risks of nuclear war, whether it's risks from artificial intelligence, whether it's this myriad of problems that there are. But we do have a track record, at least of not having completely destroyed ourselves as of yet. And I do think there are lots of examples that are under-discussed of solving problems and then making a better world going forwards. Whether it's things like solving the ozone hole crisis, whether it's things like preventing starvation from overpopulation in previous times, where we've gotten much better at using less agricultural land and producing a lot more food on it, or of using energy resources more efficiently. There's lots of problems that have been solved in the past to make our world better today. And I think there's no guarantee, but there's a strong chance that there will come a future where people will live lives that will make us look like we were living in misery, and they will be grateful to their ancestors for having produced that world for them to live comfortably. I mean, obviously, if we fail, then they won't be bringing us back, either because the world will be destroyed or because they will have no desire to do so. But my hope is that if they're sitting there in 2200, let's say, and they're like, this is pretty good, and there's the preserved brains and bodies of the people who helped make their world, they'll be like, that would be a worthwhile and fun challenge to bring them back and to show them what it is that we've done and created and what they helped bring about.
God, it's just going to kill me that I'm not going to live long enough to find out if that's going to happen or not. I really want to know.
Well, there's maybe ways.
Aha, that's right. You've got the answers. You heard it here first. There is a way for us to live long enough to find out if that happens. Okay, I have to say, great work, team, because one of the questions I really wanted to have time to ask but haven't, that is on my list, is the very first question that you've all upvoted, so you are fabulous. And that is the question of grief, which you and I did discuss a little bit. So this wonderful question is, what do you think about interrupting the process of grief and the need for closure after losing someone if there's a possibility that they could come back? Which is one of the very first things that I thought about when I read the book. So, what does this process look like? Is it a medical procedure? Is it a funeral? Is it something completely different that we don't know of yet? What does this look like?
Yeah, I guess I should start by saying I'm a neuroscientist rather than a grief specialist or counselor. So I would consider other ideas than the ones I'm about to suggest as also possibly very valid and valuable. I would probably imagine that this would be quite similar to a traditional funeral, insofar as if you're imagining taking someone who's dying and preserving them, you don't know whether it's going to work, whether you're going to be able to bring them back at some point in the future. Secondly, it's not like we're on the cusp of being able to restore someone back to health. It won't be a month, or probably it won't be a year. It probably won't even be a decade or several decades until such time. So whether or not they're truly gone forever, they will be gone for quite some time. And I think even if you had a guarantee that they would come back in 50 years' time, losing anyone for 50 years is extremely sad and painful and damaging to their loved ones, their social networks, their relationships. So I can't imagine any scenario under which there wouldn't be extremely heavy grieving, and where we'd probably want to be using pretty similar grieving rituals and methods to what we have today, if maybe just with a bit of hope added in. But yeah, I guess, I mean, this might sound a little strange, and I don't want to be flippant, but it does remind me more of perhaps what historically people would have thought about grief intermixed with seeing people in the afterlife, where it wasn't a forever they're gone. It's like maybe if one day we go to heaven together, I'll be able to see them again. And that's probably the sort of ideas I would lean on. carefully for this.
No, I can absolutely see that analogy. Thank you.
But with a lot more uncertainty, unfortunately.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Our next question, which is also a really excellent one, is given what you described as the definition of death that you're working with, is dementia death?
So that's a very similar sort of question to like where exactly does one draw the line? And again, I think we have to be really careful because again, on the one hand, if somebody is in the very early stages of dementia or pre-dementia or they have mild cognitive impairment, they still have their personality, they still have their long-term memories, they still, like, to themselves and their friends and family, they mostly seem like the same person they've always been. Maybe a bit more forgetful, but otherwise the same. And I would absolutely not want to say that is now, that person has died, they're a different person to who was there before. And on the other end of the extreme, if we've reached the stage where somebody is catatonic or unconscious or they seem to have lost everything, then I think there is a reasonable argument to be made that maybe that person is not the same person who was there before. Even if they are conscious, but they're just have complete personality alteration to the best of what we can see and memory loss to the best of what we can see, what we might think is that's still a human being, a conscious creature whose welfare we should be concerned with, but it would be legitimate to question whether that's the same person or not. But there is the hard question of like, at what level of damage do we start to say maybe that is or maybe that isn't the same person who was there before? And my view is it probably really just is a fuzzy boundary somewhere where that we'll never be able to draw a clean line and to say here it is or here it's not, and that it is something that individuals themselves and doctors and scientists and society at large should be trying to discuss and come up with guidelines around if we're seriously taking this idea of preservation as something we might want to do. But it's a really tricky question.
Yeah, and a really excellent question. Let me have a look. Thank you for that response, by the way. We have a really good question from Elliot, which is, so thank you, Elliot. I imagine many people will walk away thinking that this was a thought-provoking and fun talk. I hope so. Thanks, Elliot. I'd be pleased if that were the case. But the question is, but if you were to actually try and really rally people into action, what would you say and what would you want people to be doing?
So the first thing I would keep in mind is if you go and you ask people who are dying in hospices, so people really at death's door, who are still able to fill out surveys, speak to people who are asking them questions, and if you ask them, like, do you want to continue living? If there was some way in which you could carry on, have your disease cured, or have treatments available, how strong is your will to live? What you will find is that the vast majority of them still express a very strong will to live. So something about 70% of respondents describe having a strong will to live. And of those who don't, it's typically people who are in bad pain, bad nausea, bad social connections. And if you can treat some of those, their acute pain, for example, often their will to live goes back up. So what I would want everyone to keep in mind is a lot of people at death's door really wish there was something that could exist for them that would be able to give them a chance of living longer. And keeping that in mind, then what I would hope is that people ask, well, what is it that we can do? Like, if it's anti-aging medicine, if it's preservation, if it's other sorts of technologies or research, like, this is something that we want. This is something that I want for myself, for my friends, for my family, for my loved one, and what are the methods that we could use to actually get there? And then I guess if they are still on board at that stage, I'd be like, okay, we should actually put more money and research into establishing providers that can provide these sorts of procedures.
And I have to just follow up with my own question. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but what has the response been to the book? Like, do you feel like a lot of people are on board? Do you feel like if this is becomes a movement, are people really, you know, when you and I chatted, you said the main problem is that this is a really weird out there idea and people are uncomfortable with weird out there ideas. Have you had huge amounts of pushback, or have you actually had a lot of people going, okay, I've just never really thought about this before. I can see there's some merit to exploring this further?
Yeah, I would say overwhelmingly it's been that second one, where like it's so, I mean, death is always confronting. Even in traditional medicine, it's confronting. Even when doing standard retirement planning, end-of-life planning, it's confronting. Let alone if you're also asking questions about what exactly does happen in dementia? Or could we live in the future? Wouldn't that be scary? What would I do? It's disorienting. Is this something that I could afford? All these sorts of things. Like there's a lot of conceptual, technical barriers along with this is a really weird idea that I'm not used to and haven't heard explored. And will people think I'm weird if I start talking about it? But I do think when I talk to people for a while and I run through these ideas, after a while, I do often hear a lot of sympathy for, I do think, though, that if I lived in good health and there was some way that I could continue to live in good health, that's something that I might be interested in pursuing. So, I guess that's my answer.
And one of the things that I think Ariel does really effectively in the book is preempt nearly every argument, disagreement, question, concern you could have, and really thoughtfully and carefully and with evidence respond to it. So I found myself constantly thinking, how did you know that that's exactly what I was worrying about at that point? And then you went and answered it for me. So I do think that, you know, this is a book to take seriously. It's certainly a bit out there, but it's absolutely something that I would love all of you to read and think about and see where you kind of end up. But I think our next question is probably one that many of us are thinking about, and that is it in fact counterproductive to abolish death given all the problems? So given rising population, housing crises, climate emergency, you know, as discussed, the planet is not in great shape. So is this, I would say, counterproductive and also potentially irresponsible for us to think about this?
Yeah, I think about it as a similar question to should we stop having children? Or should we be not providing medical treatment to people who are no longer productive and aren't doing things to contribute to the world? Or should we be, in other ways, trying to reduce our impact and everyone else's impact upon the world? Where on the one hand, there's definitely things we want to avoid. Like, we don't want to destroy the planet. We don't want to cause undue harm to future generations. We want to make sure that everyone has a chance of living a healthy and prosperous life. But we also have to consider what are the trade-offs that we should make to enable that, what are the probabilities of damage under various different scenarios, and how do we ensure things are distributed equitably to all those people. And I think in the same way that many people feel when they think about the possibility of having kids, where they're like, look, it's scary, and kids consume resources, and they might not have good lives, but also it's valuable to have people who get to experience the world, who get to have joy and friends and have connections and all of those good things. It's the same sort of thing where if we think about why we provide medical treatment to people, it's so that they can continue to have more health, more time, more good experiences, and maybe also be productive members of society who can help to address some of these problems. And so taking it to the extreme of thinking about indefinite life extension, it's just a question of how much damage do we think we will do by preserving people and maybe one day reviving them versus how much good could we get from that. And I guess the sort of cheating thing I get to say here is people who are preserved, they're not actually consuming very many resources. They're kind of just in their stasis. And we don't have to bring them back unless we've reached the point where we think it is socially and economically sustainable to do so. So it's actually possibly even an easier question than should we be having kids or spending money on all sorts of other things instead of just spending money on trying to mitigate damage. But I am at least optimistic that we will solve the challenges of climate change, of nuclear war, of all these sorts of things, because I think there's a lot of smart people working hard on it. And I often feel that we hear about ongoing problems and failures, and the news focuses so much more on the negatives than the actual good work that people are doing out there to solve these problems.
I like your optimism.
Yeah.
I'm also an optimist, so I'm very happy to engage with that optimism. There's a really interesting question here that lots of people have upvoted that I would like to get to, which is, what is the general consensus in your field about the intersection between neural mapping, data sovereignty, and the idea that our minds are the last frontier of privacy?
Wow, that is a great question, and admittedly one I have thought about somewhat, but not in probably the full depth that the question warrants. So I do think that obviously if you're preserving a brain, then you're holding onto information that would normally be destroyed, and you're doing so for an extended duration of time where a person is helpless. So it's like you've taken someone and you've put them under anesthesia for an indefinite period of time. Now currently, if we think about patients in anesthesia in hospital, we're very concerned about the patient consenting and being in good care and no harm being done to that patient. And for good reasons, because the patient can't do anything for themselves at that point in time, we have all of these safeguards around looking after them. And I think analogously that if we wanted to pursue indefinite sort of storage of an individual, we'd need to have similarly strong safeguards around initial consent, like under what conditions people would want to be stored, under what conditions they might want to be brought back or have their brain analyzed, and to actually have strong regulatory frameworks to make sure that that was done properly. In terms of the then dangers that are introduced by this gets quite speculative around if you're starting to do things like actually restore people to consciousness or do brain emulations or uploading or that sort of thing. That does open up a whole set of ideas that I think philosophers are already exploring at the moment and ethicists are exploring. There are research fields looking at brain privacy, even with modern brain-computer interfaces that are implantable. But that gets a little bit beyond. I'm not sure the exact details of the frameworks people have in mind in that space already.
But fantastic question and something for us all to really think about. We are nearly out of time, but I'm going to sneak in one last question. So this is my thought experiment for you. So let's picture this, that we're in the future, you are about to be brought back, and just before you passed away and were preserved, you were given the opportunity to record a short voice message that people would listen to at the point that they were just about to bring you back in some, real or digital form. What are you going to say in that voice message? What do you want these people of the future to know?
Thank you. Just probably crying and thank you would be all I could get out if I really took that seriously. I would assume that if I'd gotten to that point and the world had gotten to that point, things have gone well. We haven't destroyed ourselves. There hasn't been nuclear war. AI has been shepherded well. Future generations have decided to invest in the money that it would take to produce this new medical technology. Just so much gratitude for the people who would be there helping me at that point in time is what I would want to try and convey.
Fantastic. Thank you. Could you join me in thanking Ariel? I'm feeling very grateful for you and your communication skills. I thought that was really clear, fascinating, so many things for us to think about. Thank you to all of you for your really excellent questions. I'm so delighted that some of the questions I wanted to ask but didn't get to, you did, so thank you for that. And I guess I hope that whether you're convinced or not about this book's argument, that you're leaving with a clearer sense of the science and the ethics and just the possibilities that maybe are not that far off of preserving some form of human consciousness into the future. I think it's an amazing thing for us to be thinking about. Many thanks again to the Chestnut Tree Bookshop, who have copies of the book up in the back corner all ready for you to purchase if you would like. Shortly, Ariel will be signing copies of his book for you. And I'm going to leave you with a final quote from the book, and that is this: "Should we secure our future, what we know of the human spirit tells us that we will not be going gently into that good night, but with all engines blazing towards the stars. So good night, and thank you again to you for coming, to Ariel for your fantastic sharing of your book with us, to the Wheeler Centre and the Now or Never Festival, and good night.